There are some games I'll never be able to play. It's not because of any controls, as thankfully I still have use of both of my hands, with only small dysfunctions. I'm not deaf or hard of hearing at all, even though sometimes I have issues with high-pitched noises and ringing sounds. Though 1 in 12 men are colorblind, I'm not, at least not as far as I've tested. If I need to for a project, or just want to, I can play games for long hours at a time without getting tired. No, the problem is just as simple, yet as sinister. I need a good view. A video game's field of view, or the scope of one's vision, is something most people don't think about day to day. After all, we don't walk around with horse blinders. But in the world of media, and especially video games, there's a small yet vocal subset of people for whom it's something they can't ignore. Field of view becomes something more than another addition to the accessibility menu. It's a necessary inclusion. It's something I need. Before delving into the why it matters though, we need to be on the same page of what field of view even is. For normal, real-life, human meatballs-in-your-face perception, usually what we call our eyes, field of view is defined as the extent of the observable world that is seen at any given moment. But in terms of video games, it's much more simply the amount of game view that is on display during a game. So then, how much FOV do humans have? Researchers in optics have most commonly said that people have about 180 degrees field of vision. More specifically, we have 114 degrees of binocular vision and another 60 to 70 of peripheral vision. The former encompasses depth perception and what we focus on, while the latter is for situational awareness. By comparison, most video games usually use a field of view of roughly 70 to 80 degrees. That may seem like a startling low amount that would make anyone uncomfortable, but it's a little more complex than that in reality. Several sources state that while FOV can err to one side or the other accounting for taste, there actually is an objective value for everyone, which is when the game space looks natural to you. Though that definition is simple to a fault, so to put it another way, the world in which you're looking needs to have as little distortion as possible, if any, but that perception changes depending on your distance from the screen. This is why the average console player sitting upwards of 4 to 6 feet away from their screen doesn't tend to have issues with low field of view historically, whereas PC players, when sitting at a desk, have had issues for about as long as first-person games have existed. The memes and jokes about PC players needing FOV sliders and often scaling said sliders up to triple digits didn't come from nowhere. If anything, it sources from the desire to not vomit all over their screens. Said vomiting is a consequence of the most common issue associated with a low field of view relative to the user: motion sickness. This persists not just in video games, but in cinema, and obviously in real life. To date, a book hasn't made me motion sick, but I'm not counting anything out these days. The website Game Accessibility Guidelines describes the issue as rooting from the field of view being significantly different to what the eye and brain expect to see. The NHK provides a bit more detail, saying it's when the inner ear sends different signals to your brain from what your eyes are seeing, although in video games that more directly relates to VR form of sickness. There are several papers citing all kinds of theories for why motion sickness exists in the first place, from the body trying to parse different inputs at once, to a mismatch of current stimuli and what one remembers, a possible defense against poison intoxication, and much more. It's worth noting, however, that while just changing the virtual camera's field of view, sans anything else, can help, it's also dependent on the way the world is perceived from the camera to the virtual objects. Rather, as Burning Bun says on Reddit,
seems that despite higher FOV being an important part in reducing motion sickness, if the hands and guns remain too close to the screen, your eyes will still perceive the screen as having low FOV despite the broader field the screen is showing you.
FOV isn't the only cause of motion sickness, and sickness isn't the only side effect of low FOV. Though, I don't know about you, but I'd rather not keep feeling like I ingested poison just because I'm trying to do dailies, get kills, or enjoy a good story. So if it causes all these issues, then why don't all games just max out their respective fields of view and save the trouble? There's a few reasons. First off though, I want to impart all the advantages of a high field of view. As already mentioned, high FOV helps reduce motion sickness, headaches, migraines, and other physical ailments as it gets closer to or beyond our natural field of vision. It also helps with situational awareness, as while we can't focus on an entire 16:9 display's worth of content, we'll passively use our peripheral vision to pick up on important things like enemies, objects of interest, or environmental cues. And last, and arguably least, for some it's just a matter of pure taste. Game look good when not scrunchy. By contrast, it may seem like there's no reason to go with a lower field of view. but there are a few. Commonly, people like to reference low FOV in horror games the same way we do in films, and how it can be used to create a sense of claustrophobia, thereby inducing fear, tension, and/or stress in the player or viewer. It's also been said by professional Counter-Strike players that using a low field of view combined with a tighter aspect ratio helps their eyes and brain concentrate on what's directly in front of them rather than breaking attention from peripheral movement. Go low enough and the targets can even be distorted and stretched larger, making them easier to hit. The obvious answer, though, comes from developers themselves, who have often employed a low and locked-in field of view in their games for the sole purpose of gaining or sustaining a decent frame rate. Practically speaking, the lower the scope of a player's view, the less pixels have to be rendered on screen at any given time, and the higher the frame rate. This is why changing the FOV in some games creates a message along the lines of increasing this value may impact performance. In the case of console games, where the ability to change settings never really took off in the way that PC games did due to a lack of modularity, there may not be a choice to the developers after target fidelity and frame rate are established. Further research shows that in the case of some games, changing the FOV wasn't an option, additionally because certain assets are being held off screen, it would break the myriad of tricks developers use to hide things not currently needed. Matt DeWald, the senior tech producer of 2018's God of War, said in a PC Gamer interview,
"It's not just setting resolution and done. I wish it was that easy. If you widen the aspect ratio without increasing FOV, it just doesn't look quite right to our brains. But once you widen the FOV, you start seeing things that you were never supposed to, like in bad HD remasters of old TV shows. Now there's all this stuff that was on the edge and cut off on 16:9 that is now in the scene. Like, oh no, Atreus is warping through the scene because he's getting into position."
Or in the case of Power Wash Simulator developer Future Lab, it outright broke the game.
Our aim for the new custom FOV system was to keep the hand/equipment visuals consistent across the FOV range while making sure that the water spray visual effects render correctly from the nozzle all the way to the surfaces you're cleaning, regardless of how low or high the FOV is. This ended up being a trickier task than anticipated for us because Power Wash Simulator works a bit differently from most FPS games. The washer spray interacts directly with the environment as a continuous, unbroken stream of water rather than muzzle flashes at one end and bullet decals at the other. After some R&D, we disassembled and rebuilt the whole camera setup, added lots of vertex shader magic, implemented new custom projection matrix calculations under the hood, as well as some forced perspective camera trickery to get things looking as they should.
That's no small feat, I imagine, and I'm thankful for the work they put into that. Though even pushing everything else aside, there's just no one-size-fits-all approach anyway. While someone like me all but requires a high field of view to experience video games and gets motion sick and migraines otherwise, others are more sensitive to the fisheye distortion of higher fields of vision and would rather keep it lower. Thankfully, no matter your preference, more games these days are launching with field of view sliders built right in, much to the surprise and elation of many people who have long since been dogging forums in the hopes of some kind of change. Even older games that already launched without any kind of official adjustment have also been receiving updates later on after player requests. In some cases, very long after. It's still not perfect, however, as sometimes changes are made to games that actually break the work players put in to modify the files and let them play comfortably, but that doesn't stop the community from keeping at it. It's always been the case in history that if those in power won't make changes, the people will. And that thankfully holds true for something as relatively small as changing a virtual camera's scope of vision. This tracks all the way back to people telling other players in person or in forums how to change the FOV in classic first-person games, all the way up to the modern day of entire programs being created for the sole purpose of making games more accessible to all. Flawless widescreen is arguably the haven for many who have been looking for quick fixes without having to dig into INI files to change values with every game. And additional support arrives from PC Gaming Wiki for laying out in plain terms whether a game offers FOV options, what kind, and if not, possible solutions. And all that exists needs to exist, because everyone who enjoys games doesn't want to be locked out of a possible experience over something as small as a camera's value, to the point where they'll go out of way to fix what developers and publishers can't or won't. I imagine some of you, even now, remain unconvinced. Maybe you think to yourself, that sounds bad for sure, but I myself don't have any issues with any game's field of view, so I don't care. It doesn't affect me. It's easy to not care, because it's hard to imagine what it's like to need, not want, need these options to enjoy one of your favorite activities. But I also want you to consider this, for even a moment. We all believe that we'll age gracefully through life, that nothing will go wrong with our bodies and minds, that we'll always be able to enjoy the things that we consistently have because our circumstances will always be within our control. We don't get into accidents. We don't abuse substances. We won't let our bodies break down as nature takes its inevitable and irreversible course upon us. But the real fact is that isn't true. When I was younger, I maxed out the volume of my music through my earbuds in public and closed car windows to shut out the world. I went to concerts without plugs because I wanted to feel the movements of the beats in my body. I stared into computer monitors all day and night, thinking it didn't matter as long as it was a distraction. Today, I have mild tinnitus and I wear computer glasses all day and night, hoping I won't be needing a hearing aid and thick-rimmed goggles eventually. And maybe that's not you. Honestly, I personally hope it's not. I hope everything is fine with you. But it may one day not be. And so even if you don't think today that you need something so silly, so minuscule as a field of view slider, the you of tomorrow, or next month, or next year, might have wished you did. I didn't make this video about the entirety of accessibility needs because I can't personally speak on many of them. But a video game's field of view is something that has always mattered to me, and it's becoming harder to watch games come and go that I simply cannot play. Maybe one day I'll have to stick to strategy games, card games, platformers, or other such things. Maybe one day I'll have to give up on games altogether, in spite of the increased developer and community help. But if that's going to be the case, inevitably, then I want to enjoy as many games as possible before then, and I want that for others too. And if something were to happen to those of you who think today that it doesn't matter yet still, I hope you'll be able to as well.